Biomed Nexus. Daily updates, your essential biotech, medtech, and pharma recap. No noise, just what matters. TLDR Washington is running two China strategies at once. Operation TrialBlazer is the carrot, an HHS push to win clinical trials back to the US by cutting 6 to 12 months off early timelines. The House probe is the stick, with 5 pharma CEOs due to answer on Friday. Biopharma Dive asked the obvious question, is TrialBlazer enough? AstraZeneca has now signed 4 China licensing deals since the start of 2025, trailing only Roche among major pharmas. It signed 2 of them last week. China Medical System tapped in silico for a $1.2 billion yuan CNS collaboration, another Chinese company reaching for AI drug discovery. About 2/3 of venture rounds in the first half went to companies that already have a drug in human testing. The funding gap for earlier-stage biotechs keeps widening. The FDA proposed a streamlined pathway for registering hub and spoke manufacturing facilities and moved to clarify how foreign API producers register. Executive takeaway, the China story has 2 halves, and this week you get to see both. On one side, Operation TrialBlazer, the HHS initiative launched in late June to drag clinical trials back to American soil. The diagnosis behind it is stark and, honestly, correct. China now registers more clinical trials than the United States. It passed us in early-phase studies. And American companies spent more than $137 billion licensing Chinese assets, which means US capital is funding Chinese intellectual property, Chinese first-in-human data, and Chinese clinical track records. HHS projects that on current trends, drugs from Chinese biotechs could account for 35% of FDA approvals by 2040. TrialBlazer's answer is speed. Pair sponsors with academic centers and CROs, clarify IND requirements, and cut 6 to 12 months off the path to first-in-human testing. On the other side, the stick. Friday is the deadline for Merck, AbbVie, Lilly, Pfizer, and BMS to explain their China trials to the House Select Committee. Same problem, opposite approach. One arm of Washington is trying to make America competitive enough that companies choose to stay. The other is making it politically expensive to leave. Here is our read. TrialBlazer is directionally right and probably insufficient. 6 to 12 months of saved IND time is real, but it addresses the regulatory clock while leaving untouched the operational bottlenecks that actually determine speed to first patient, site activation, IRB review, patient recruitment. China's advantage is not just faster paperwork, it is faster everything at lower cost with a bigger patient pool. You do not close that gap with a pilot program. Meanwhile, the deals keep coming. AstraZeneca has now signed 4 China licensing pacts since the start of 2025, 2 of them last week alone, second only to Roche. That is the market speaking. Friday is when Washington gets its formal answer, but the industry has already answered with its checkbook. Read full analysis. China and policy Washington is trying to win trials back and punish the companies that left at the same time. Operation TrialBlazer, the HHS initiative launched June 22nd, is the government's attempt to reverse the migration of clinical research to China. The numbers behind it are sobering. China now registers more clinical trials than the US and surpassed it in early-phase studies. American companies spent more than $137 billion licensing China-based assets, which HHS notes means US investment is helping Chinese firms build IP, generate first-in-human data, and establish clinical track records outside the United States. If trends hold, HHS projects drugs from Chinese biotechs could reach 35% of FDA approvals by 2040. The fix on offer, pair sponsors with academic medical centers and CROs to prepare first-in-human applications, clarify IND requirements, reform IRB processes, and cut 6 to 12 months off early trial timelines. Acting FDA Commissioner Kyle Diamantas said the overseas migration undermines both patient access and American standing in biomedical innovation. The comment window on the expedited IND pilot closes July 22nd. Meanwhile, Friday brings the House Select Committee deadline for Merck, AbbVie, Lilly, Pfizer, and BMS to account for their China trials. Carrot and stick running in parallel. Biopharma Dive framed the question directly. US trials keep losing ground to China, and it is not clear TrialBlazer is enough to catch up. China deals AstraZeneca is now the second most active China dealmaker in pharma, and it is not slowing down. AstraZeneca has signed 4 licensing deals with Chinese drug makers since the start of 2025, trailing only Roche among major pharmaceutical companies, according to Biopharma Dive. 2 of those came last week alone, the CSPC kidney collaboration and the Sino biopharmaceutical respiratory license we covered Friday. The pace landing in the same week, Congress demanded answers from 5 of its peers, is the clearest signal available that the industry is not backing away. Separately, China Medical System Holdings tapped In Silico Medicine for a $1.2 billion yuan collaboration targeting what Fierce Biotech described as a mass-market CNS indication. In Silico, the AI discovery company, has now signed deals with Takeda, Sanofi, SK Biopharmaceuticals, and Servier. The flow runs both ways, Western pharma buying Chinese assets and Chinese pharma buying AI discovery capability. Capital markets, venture money is only going to companies that already made it to the clinic. About 2/3 of venture rounds in the first half went to startups with a drug already in human testing, according to Biopharma Dive, a sign of the widening funding gap among private biotechs. It confirms the barbell we flagged Friday. Late-stage and de-risked companies are swimming in capital. Preclinical and early clinical companies are struggling to raise at all. The logic is rational for each investor and corrosive in aggregate. Everyone wants the de-risked asset. Nobody wants to fund the risky science that produces de-risked assets 5 years later. The 10B acquisitions closing today were seed rounds a decade ago. If the early-stage drought persists, the pipeline of acquirable assets in the 2030s gets thin, and the M&A boom that looks so healthy right now runs out of things to buy. Manufacturing, the FDA moved to simplify how distributed manufacturing gets registered. The FDA proposed a streamlined pathway for registering hub and spoke production facilities and clarified how foreign API producers should register, according to Fierce Pharma. Hub and spoke models, where a central facility coordinates with distributed production sites, have become more common as companies build regional supply chains in response to tariffs and geopolitical risk. The foreign API registration piece matters more than it sounds. API supply concentration overseas, particularly in China and India, has been the quiet vulnerability under every drug shortage story we have covered this year, from the Iran war disruptions to the cisplatin and carboplatin shortage in India. Clearer registration rules are a small step toward visibility into who actually makes what. Coming up, Friday, July 17, the 5 named farmers respond to the House China Trials probe. July 22nd, comment window, closes on the FDA's expedited IND pilot. July 31st, Section 232 pharma tariffs effective for large companies. August 2026, Replimune RP1 FDA response. Imminent, Revolution Medicines, CNPV filing, Lilly Foundayo, T2D filing, read, full analysis, Biomed, Nexus. Pro, institutional intelligence. Brief, why TrialBlazer, probably is not enough, operation. TrialBlazer diagnoses the problem correctly. China runs more trials, runs them faster, and runs them cheaper, and American capital has been funding that shift to the tune of $137 in licensing. HHS is right to treat this as a competitiveness emergency rather than a paperwork issue, but look at where the initiative actually intervenes. The center of gravity is the regulatory portion of the pre-trial timeline. IND quality, IND review, clearer FDA expectations, a Phase 1 IND Navigator webpage, master protocol guidance, all useful. All aimed at the clock that runs between when a sponsor is ready to file and when the FDA says go. That is not where the time actually goes. Speed to first patient is determined by site activation, contract negotiation with institutions, IRB review, and above all, patient recruitment. Those are operational bottlenecks that live in hospitals, academic centres, and CRO networks, not at the FDA. Australia gets ethics approval in 3 to 4 weeks and activates sites in 6 to 12 weeks. China moves faster still with a vast treatment-naive patient population and a system built to enroll quickly. Cutting 6 to 12 months off the IND process does not touch any of that. The honest read is that TrialBlazer is a real improvement to the part of the system the FDA controls, and the part the FDA controls is not the binding constraint. To genuinely compete, the US would need IRB reform with teeth, standardized site contracts, and a serious answer on recruitment cost and speed. TrialBlazer gestures at IRB reform. Whether that gesture becomes substance is the thing to watch. For sponsors, the practical takeaway is unchanged. If you need a fast, cheap first-in-human study, China is still the answer, and it will remain the answer for the foreseeable future. TrialBlazer narrows the gap at the margin. It does not close it. Read AstraZeneca's behavior, not the statements. Everyone in pharma will say the right things about the congressional probe this week. If you want to know what the industry actually believes, watch what companies do rather than what they say. AstraZeneca has signed 4 China licensing deals since the start of 2025, second only to Roche. It signed 2 of them last week, in the same 7-day stretch that the House Select Committee's letters to 5 of its peers were making headlines. That is not a company that thinks a wall is coming. The distinction matters. AstraZeneca is not among the 5 named companies, so it has more room to move than Merck, Lilly, Pfizer, BMS, or AbbVie do right now. But its behavior reveals the underlying calculation the whole industry is making. The political risk is real but manageable. The science is too good to walk away from, and the first movers who keep building China pipelines will be better positioned than the ones who flinch. What we expect Friday: careful, detailed, on time, written responses from all 5. Emphasis on ethical review, data protection, and full legal compliance. No admissions because the committee itself said it found no wrongdoing, and no new China deals from any of the 5 before the deadline because the optics would be indefensible. What would change our read? If one of the 5 voluntarily pulled trials from Xinjiang or military-affiliated hospitals, that would signal they see binding restrictions coming. If the committee moves to subpoenas or a televised hearing, the letters were an opening move. Absent either, our base case holds. Friction rises, the deals continue, and the cost of doing business in China gets priced into the next round of term sheets. When the early-stage drought starts to hurt, 2/3 of first-half venture rounds went to companies with a drug already in human testing. That is the cleanest statement yet of the barbell we have been tracking. Here is the timing problem. A preclinical company that cannot raise today is not a headline in 2026. It is a missing acquisition target in 2032. Drug development takes 8 to 12 years from discovery to approval. The 10B deals that Big Pharma is signing right now, Vertex and Crinetics, AbbVie and Apogee, GSK and Nuvalent, are all for assets that were early-stage bets in the mid-2010s, funded when early-stage capital was plentiful. Run that forward. If early-stage funding stays depressed through 2026 and 2027, the cohort of Phase 2 and Phase 3 assets available for acquisition in the early 2030s shrinks. Pharma still faces its patent cliffs. The demand for de-risked assets does not go away. What changes is that there are fewer of them, and the prices go up. Ironically, that is good news for anyone who does manage to raise early-stage money now and get an asset into the clinic. Scarcity in 2032 means premium valuations. The founders who can survive this funding winter will find themselves holding assets in a seller's market. For everyone else, the practical read: if you are preclinical, the bar to raise is higher than it has been in years, and the fastest path to capital is generating human data, even in a small study, even offshore, even at a compromise on trial design. That reality is precisely what pushes companies toward China, which brings this whole story back around to where it started. Washington is trying to win China's trials back with one hand and investigate the companies that left with the other. AstraZeneca signed 2 more China deals last week and did not blink. And venture money keeps flowing only to companies that already made it to the clinic. Friday is the deadline. What are you watching? Reply to this email. Visit the Pro Hub Read. Full article: is your company listed in the Biomed Nexus directory? 2,104 companies across 14 categories. Claim or upgrade your listing. Sponsorship slots for 2026 are limited. See packages and pricing. New Biomed Nexus signals: weekly sales intelligence for life sciences BD teams. Learn more